This is Saving Toby from Mary Bush. Toby motioned for Osvaldo to follow him closer to the river's edge. Sand ripples showed underneath the water until, a yard from shore, the bottom disappeared into murkiness. The sandbar was 5 feet wide and nearly 15 feet long. An easy target. Toby's stones hit the edge of the bar, but Osvaldo's always splashed short. Soon they were panting from the exertion. Toby poked his toes into the water. Osvaldo took off his shoes and stood beside Toby, the cool water tickling his feet. Toby told Osvaldo how a whole steamship with hundreds of people on board were sitting at the river bottom right there where he was pointing. He repeated words for Osvaldo to say: river, gold, pirates. The river flowed steadfastly past them. Ocean waves pushed a shell or a clump of weeds onto the shore, then sucked it out, and then threw it back on shore again. But whatever this river took did not come back. "Go on," Toby encouraged him, knowing the dangers of playing in the forbidden river. "Go swim," he pointed to the sandbar. "Swim on out to the sandbar," he motioned to his waist, assuring Osvaldo that the water was only that deep. Toby found a stick, then poked it into the water as far in front of him as he could reach. "See, it ain't even deep," he said. They were standing in the shallow water to their ankles, whipping the stick in the water and stirring up the muddy bottom while the woods behind them thrummed with insects and bird song. "Big old giant fish live out in the deep middle," Toby said. "He'd jump up one time, swallow a whole riverboat, all one gulp." He squatted down so low that water lapped at his rear end. Then they were both sitting in the water. Toby flung off his ragged shirt. They leaned back on their elbows and let their legs float, the current swaying them toward the landing. Osvaldo heard a sound, like branches moving or someone walking, coming from the woods behind them, above the sound of the river. He touched Toby's arm and motioned for him to listen. But no parents emerged, no sisters. It gave Osvaldo a creepy feeling, as if the woods were alive and had eyes. A great white bird rose up from the grassy shore nearby and flapped across the water, pulling its long dark legs in close to its body, its bulky wings almost dipping into the water as it skimmed the surface. And then the bird rose higher, stretched its crooked neck, made a graceful swooping turn, and landed farther down near the shore. Osvaldo asked Toby if he'd seen the bird, but Toby merely flopped onto his stomach and rested his chin in his hands, his legs floating behind him. Water licked at his face, and he laughed and raised his chin. He had done this only once before, alone, but now with another boy beside him, it was as if he had always played in the river. Then a turtle floated by, and the boys waded in water to their knees to retrieve it. And now that Toby was in the water and his feet were still touching bottom, all the warnings he heard about playing in the river vanished. It wasn't until his foot slipped and he felt his leg dropping and then his body following that something woke in him. He thrashed his arms and screamed for help. Osvaldo took a step toward him and then stopped. Toby churned his arms toward shore as the current pulled him slowly in the opposite direction. His mouth opened and shut as he tried to cry for help while spitting in the water to keep from choking him. Osvaldo turned toward the trees. "Aweto!" he shouted. "Aweto!" He turned back and shouted in Italian for Toby to swim and tried to reach an arm out to him. Finally, he ran for the stick the boy had been playing with and called for Toby to grab it, but the stick was ridiculously short. All the while, Toby's panicked eyes laid on Osvaldo. His face bobbed further out in the water so that he looked like a flower, a dark floating blossom. Osvaldo stared mutely at the bobbing flower and then took off running for the trees. Their dinner break was nearly over when Fancy Hall and Amalia Pascala each looked up, their noses raised as if catching something in the air. Their eyes moved slowly over the children and adults sprawled around them, and their ears listened, although neither of them knew in these moments what they were listening for. Their eyes met briefly as they rose to their feet. By the time they were standing, what their bodies had unknowingly sensed turned to sudden consciousness. Within seconds, the entire group was running into the woods, calling for the boys. They broke through the trees into the sandy clearing. At the same time, Osvaldo leaped from the sand onto the scrub oaks, shouting incoherently. Step Hall reached out as if to steady himself and caught the boy by the arm. For a moment, Osvaldo dangled in midair while a dozen pairs of startled eyes watched his churning feet, the great river flowing behind him. Then Step dropped the boy, and they ran for the river. Fancy screamed when she saw her son slapping at the water, a dull, exhausted look on his face. He had already been carried another 20 feet downstream and further away from the shore. Step splashed into the water while his wife followed, her arms stretched toward the boy. The others grabbed her skirt to keep her from throwing herself into the river. Step's foot slipped at a drop-off, and he plunged into water to his waist. He struggled against the current to keep his footing. Someone called for a rope, and the scrawny old man ran back to the wagons. Another man cursed himself for not bringing a rope when they'd first run into the woods. Where else would young boys be, after all, than in the river where they weren't supposed to be? As if on cue, the Black Americans joined hands, making a chain of their bodies that allowed Step to venture farther into the water. The Italians added their own bodies as links in the chain, but the water became too deep and the current too strong. "Daddy!" Tobe gasped as the water tugged at him. The distance widened between them. Amalia pulled Osvaldo close and called the girls to her side. "Pray for the little boy," she told them. Seraphin waded into the water, holding onto the outstretched arms until he reached Step Hall, the shouting and crying close in his ears. He grabbed Step's arm and leaned onto the river, reaching for Tobe as if beckoning him from the water. The motion jarred him. Once again, he was touching his brother Valero's hand. He held the fingers for a moment, and then Valero disappeared. He let go of Step Hall. His feet touched bottom for just a moment before the current lifted him, and he started swimming. "Fool, Seraphin!" Amalia shrieked. "Come back!" Osvaldo watched in horror as his father was carried away. "Daddy!" he cried out. "What are you going?" He knew he was the cause of this. "Mi scusa," Osvaldo cried. Seraphin had seen foolish young men who thought they could fight the sea and win, a dangerous attitude for a fisherman to have. He never thought of himself as such a man, but now he felt his anger against the river rising. And he tried to calm it. It was the anger that killed you. It was easy to reach the boy, as he knew it would be. Returning would be a whole nother matter. Tobe turned his eyes to Seraphin like a baby waking from sleep. "Stai bene," Seraphin told him. "You're going to be okay." He slipped his arm under Tobe's, lifting him in the water so he could breathe. And Tobe whimpered. The water cradled Seraphin and the boy as they held each other, and then Seraphin turned his head sharply to see how far he had drifted from shore, and the sight shocked him. It may as well have been the middle of the ocean, he thought. The water felt surprisingly cold now. It tugged at his legs, and for a moment he kicked out violently, thinking he had become snagged in something, but it was only the current playing tricks on him. He plowed the water with his right arm while he fought to keep the boy above water with the other. He heard nothing from shore, but he saw the tense, frightened faces watching him, the way he had watched twice from his boat. The cold water made his legs feel heavy and sluggish. The boy was weightless beside him, an empty burlap sack. "Stai bene?" he called out, his lips brushing the boy's cheek like a kiss. There was no answer. Just a slight movement, perhaps a splash of the hand. His arm ached. He wondered how such a small child had been able to swim against the current for so long. He told himself to try not to think about the pain and the distance between himself and the shore. It would have been hard enough to swim with both arms, but this way, holding on to the boy, it seemed impossible. Just one more stroke, one more, and then another, and then another. Lazaro waved his arms at Seraphin as the group followed him slowly downstream. "Be strong!" Lazaro shouted. "Don't give up!" Suddenly Seraphin was afraid. It was as if the river had stopped for a moment and he could see everything clearly. It had not crossed his mind when he stepped into the water that he might not come out alive. Now he saw the terrified looks on his wife and children and best friend. "Don't give up! Hold on!" Lazaro called, and Seraphin was stunned to realize he was drowning. What would happen to his wife and children? How could he leave them alone in the hell he had brought them to, with the pain of his death to further burden them? Visiting him at Heiner Cemetery, where the rest of the godforsaken Italians lay. A black man waded into the water, extending a rope to Seraphin, then letting it drop when he saw that a rope was useless. "Come on," Lazaro shouted, "just a little bit more." Seraphin blinked his eyes hard, trying to clear the water from them, and he was surprised a second time to realize he had actually inched himself closer to shore, even though the current carried him downstream. Just his fate, he thought. To die like this, not a mule's length from being saved. That's part 1, part 2 coming up.